Appendix V, Crimea and Donbas. Crimea, historical context. The Crimean Peninsula occupies a unique position in both physical geography and historical memory, situated at the crossroads of European, Slavic, and Turkic civilizations. This strategically located peninsula of approximately 27,000 square kilometers extends into the Black Sea, connected to the mainland by the narrow Isthmus of Perkop. Its natural harbors and defensible position have made it a prized territorial possession throughout centuries of competing empires and states. The indigenous Crimean Tatar population established the Crimean Khanate in the 15th century, which existed as a powerful regional state and Ottoman vassal until the late 18th century. Russian expansion under Catherine the Great led to the annexation of Crimea in 1783, a watershed moment that expanded the Russian Empire to the Black Sea and began the peninsula's integration into Russian political, cultural, and economic systems. The city of Sevastopol was founded shortly after as a naval base, beginning its long history as a center of Russian maritime power. The Crimean War, 1853–1856, though fought throughout multiple regions, centered on the peninsula and particularly the siege of Sevastopol. This conflict, which pitted Russia against an alliance of Ottoman, British, and French forces, resulted in Russian defeat but cemented Crimea's place in Russian national consciousness. Throughout the late imperial period, Crimea increasingly became both a military stronghold and a prestigious resort destination for the Russian aristocracy. The Soviet period brought dramatic demographic changes to Crimea. In May 1944, Stalin ordered the mass deportation of the entire Crimean Tatar population, approximately 200,000 people, to Central Asia on fabricated charges of collaboration with Nazi Germany. This brutal ethnic cleansing, during which an estimated 46% of deportees died from harsh conditions, fundamentally altered Crimea's demographic composition. Soviet authorities subsequently promoted Russian settlement and renamed hundreds of Crimean Tatar villages to erase their cultural presence. A pivotal administrative decision came in 1954 when Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. While the reasons for this transfer remain debated, theories range from practical economic integration to symbolic celebration of the 300th anniversary of Russian-Ukrainian unity. It was largely symbolic within the context of the Soviet Union but would later acquire enormous geopolitical significance. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Crimea remained part of independent Ukraine, though with special autonomous status. In May 1992, the Crimean parliament declared independence but quickly rescinded this decision under Ukrainian pressure. A compromise reached in 1995 established the Autonomous Republic of Crimea within Ukraine, with its own constitution and parliament, though with limited actual powers. Meanwhile, Crimean Tatars began returning from exile, gradually re-establishing their presence despite difficult economic and social conditions. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Crimea remained a complex region within Ukraine. Its population was predominantly Russian-speaking, 77% by the 2001 census, with strong cultural and historical ties to Russia. Economically, it relied heavily on tourism, agriculture, and the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which continued to lease naval facilities in Sevastopol under agreements between Ukraine and Russia. Pro-Russian political sentiments generally prevailed, though with limited separatist activity after the initial post-Soviet period. The annexation of Crimea and its aftermath. Russia's annexation of Crimea in February–March 2014 represents one of the most significant violations of international borders in post-Cold War Europe. As previously described, following Yanukovych's ouster, unmarked Russian forces, later acknowledged as Russian Special Forces by President Putin, quickly seized control of the peninsula, while local pro-Russian politicians, notably Sergei Aksyonov, established a new government. Under military occupation, authorities organized a referendum on joining Russia, reporting overwhelming support but failing to meet international standards for free and fair voting. On March 18, 2014, Russia formally incorporated Crimea into the Russian Federation. The international response was swift but limited to non-military measures. The United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 68/262 affirming Ukraine's territorial integrity, with 100 countries supporting, 11 opposing, and 58 abstaining. The United States, European Union, and other Western allies imposed targeted sanctions on Russian officials and entities involved in the annexation. However, Russia's nuclear status and military capabilities effectively deterred direct Western intervention. For Crimean residents, the annexation brought profound changes. Russian citizenship was essentially imposed, with those refusing to accept Russian passports facing discrimination in employment, healthcare, and property rights. Ukrainian language education was marginalized, and freedoms of speech, assembly, and religion became increasingly restricted, with particular pressure on Crimean Tatars and pro-Ukrainian activists. The Mejlis, the Crimean Tatar representative body, was banned as an extremist organization in 2016. Human rights organizations have documented numerous abuses, including enforced disappearances, torture, arbitrary detentions, and show trials of political opponents. According to the Crimean Human Rights Group, by 2022, at least 19,000 Crimean men had been conscripted into the Russian military in violation of international humanitarian law. An estimated 30,000 to 50,000 residents fled the peninsula after annexation, including many Crimean Tatars and Ukrainian activists. Economically, Crimea faced mixed consequences. Russia invested heavily in infrastructure, most notably the $3.7 billion Crimean Bridge across the Kerch Strait, completed in 2018. However, international sanctions severely limited foreign investment, tourism declined from pre-annexation levels, and prices rose significantly. Water supply became a critical issue after Ukraine blocked the North Crimean Canal, which had previously supplied 85% of the peninsula's fresh water, forcing expensive Russian adaptations including desalination plants. In October 2022, the Crimean Bridge was damaged in an explosion that Russia attributed to Ukrainian special forces, though Ukraine did not officially claim responsibility. This attack on a high-profile symbol of Russian control demonstrated Crimea's continued vulnerability despite its apparent integration into Russia. Following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Crimea has served as a staging ground for military operations and has experienced occasional Ukrainian drone and missile strikes against Russian military targets. As of 2024, Russia maintains effective control over Crimea, having extensively integrated the peninsula into its legal, economic, and security frameworks. However, Ukraine and the international community continue to recognize Crimea as Ukrainian territory under illegal occupation. The peninsula's status remains a fundamental point of contention in any discussion of resolving the broader Russia-Ukraine conflict. Donbas, historical development. The Donbas region, encompassing parts of eastern Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, derives its name from the Donetsk coal basin, Donetskaya Basin, abbreviated as Donbas. This heavily industrialized area of approximately 53,000 square kilometers developed into one of Eastern Europe's major coal mining and metallurgical centers during the 19th and 20th centuries, shaping its distinct economic, cultural, and political character. Before industrialization, the region formed part of the sparsely populated, wild fields on the southern frontier of the Russian Empire. Its transformation began in the 1860s when Welsh industrialist John Hughes established metal works near present-day Donetsk, originally named Yuzivka after him. The discovery of rich coal deposits and subsequent industrial development attracted large-scale migration from across the Russian Empire, creating a diverse, predominantly working-class population. The Soviet period accelerated Donbas industrial development, with the region becoming a showcase of socialist industrialization during Stalin's five-year plans. Soviet propaganda celebrated Donbas coal miners as emblematic proletarian heroes, most famously through the Stakhanovite movement, named after local miner Alexei Stakhanov, who reportedly extracted 14 times his quota of coal in a single shift. This special status brought certain privileges to the region, including higher wages and better supplies than many other Soviet areas. Demographically, the Donbas developed a complex identity. While administratively part of Soviet Ukraine, it maintained strong Russian cultural and linguistic influences. The urban working class was predominantly Russian-speaking, though often of mixed Ukrainian-Russian ancestry or self-identification. Rural areas maintained stronger Ukrainian characteristics. This created a regionally specific identity that was neither exclusively Ukrainian nor Russian but rather Soviet in its orientation, closely tied to industrial labor and socialist ideology. Following Ukrainian independence in 1991, the Donbas faced severe economic challenges. The collapse of Soviet economic planning, declining coal quality, outdated technology, and global market competition led to widespread mine closures and deindustrialization. Between 1990 and 2013, coal production in Ukraine declined from 165 million to 83 million tons annually, with hundreds of mines shuttered. This economic deterioration occurred without adequate state support or economic diversification, leading to high unemployment, declining populations, and social problems. Politically, the Donbas became a stronghold for pro-Russian, post-Soviet political forces, particularly Viktor Yanukovych's Party of Regions, which championed the interests of local industrial oligarchs while advocating closer ties with Russia. Regional elites like Renat Akhmetov, Ukraine's richest man, consolidated enormous economic and political power. The region consistently voted for Eastern-oriented candidates in national elections, reflecting both cultural affinity with Russia and economic self-interest given trade and energy dependencies. Despite these tendencies, separatist movements remained marginal in Donbas before 2014. Surveys consistently showed that while many residents desired closer ties with Russia and greater regional autonomy, only a small minority supported secession from Ukraine. The region's complex identity was primarily expressed through calls for official bilingualism, economic protectionism, and preservation of Soviet historical memory rather than border changes. The war in Donbas, from local uprising to international conflict. The armed conflict in Donbas emerged in April 2014, following the Euromaidan Revolution and Russia's annexation of Crimea. As Ukraine's interim government took power in Kiev, anti-Maidan demonstrations occurred across southeastern Ukraine, with varying levels of local support. In the Donbas, these protests quickly evolved from demanding federalization to armed insurrection, a transformation that evidence indicates was significantly influenced by Russian intelligence services, special forces operatives, and volunteers. On April 7, 2014, armed separatists seized government buildings in Donetsk, declaring the Donetsk People's Republic, DNR. Similar events soon followed in Luhansk, establishing the Luhansk People's Republic, LNR. These entities held hastily organized independence referendums on May 11, claiming overwhelming support but lacking credible international observation. By summer, open warfare had erupted as Ukrainian forces launched an anti-terrorist operation to restore government control. The conflict's early phase was characterized by the prominent role of Russian citizens in leadership positions. Figures like Igor Strelkov Gherkin, a former FSB officer who led the seizure of Slavyansk, Alexander Borodai, who served as DNR prime minister, and other Russian nationals with military or intelligence backgrounds held key positions in the nascent separatist structures. While they claim to be volunteers, evidence suggests coordination with Russian state agencies. A critical moment came in July-August 2014, when Ukrainian forces had nearly encircled separatist strongholds. Russia responded with direct military intervention, though consistently denied by Moscow despite overwhelming evidence, involving regular army units, advanced weapons systems, and extensive logistical support. This intervention prevented a Ukrainian military victory and stabilized separatist control over approximately one-third of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, including their principal cities. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict led to the Minsk agreements, Minsk I in September 2014 and Minsk II in February 2015, negotiated by Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany. These accords called for ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weapons, and constitutional reform providing special status for separatist regions, among other provisions. However, implementation remained elusive, with both sides accusing each other of violations and disagreeing on sequencing of political and security measures. Between 2015 and 2022, the conflict settled into a static but deadly war of position along a 427-kilometer line of contact. Despite numerous ceasefire attempts, daily exchanges of fire continued, resulting in approximately 14,000 deaths by early 2022, including over 3,000 civilians. More than 1.5 million people were displaced, creating Europe's largest internal displacement crisis since the Balkan Wars. Infrastructure damage exceeded $50 billion, with hundreds of schools, hospitals, and factories destroyed or damaged. In the separatist-controlled territories, Russia established a comprehensive system of political, economic, and military control while maintaining the fiction of local independence. Moscow provided an estimated 70% of the entity's budgets, paid pensions and public sector salaries, and supplied natural gas and electricity. Russian security services maintained operational control over separatist ministries, while Russian military officers commanded the 40,000-strong separatist armed forces. Beginning in 2019, Russia accelerated passportization, issuing over 800,000 Russian passports to Donbas residents by 2022. Life in these territories was characterized by isolation, economic stagnation, and increasing integration with Russia. Independent media, Ukrainian language education, and pro-Ukrainian civil society were eliminated. The entities adopted the Russian ruble, educational curriculum, and legal codes. Many businesses were nationalized and often came under the control of figures linked to Russian interests or local warlords. COVID-19 further deepened the region's isolation and humanitarian challenges, with limited vaccine access and medical resources. Current state and future prospects. On February 21, 2022, days before launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin formally recognized the independence of the DNR and LNR, abandoning the pretense that Russia was not a party to the conflict. Following the invasion 3 days later, Russian forces, using separatist territories as a staging ground, attempted to capture additional parts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. After initial Russian advances, Ukrainian forces recaptured significant territory in Kharkiv region and parts of northern Luhansk Oblast in a successful counteroffensive in September 2022. However, Russia maintained control over approximately 70 to 80% of the Donbas, including key urban centers like Donetsk, Luhansk, and Mariupol, the latter captured after a devastating 3-month siege that reduced much of the city to rubble. On September 30, 2022, Russia announced the annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions, including Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, following internationally condemned referendums. This move, rejected by Ukraine and the vast majority of the international community, effectively incorporated the separatist entities into the Russian Federation, although Russia did not control the entirety of these regions. As of early 2024, intense fighting continues across the Donbas front, with Russian forces making incremental advances in some areas while suffering high casualties. The region has experienced catastrophic destruction, with cities like Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Severodonetsk largely reduced to ruins. Environmental damage is severe, including flooded mines releasing toxic substances into groundwater, widespread contamination from munitions, and damaged industrial facilities leaking hazardous materials. The future status of Crimea and Donbas remains one of the most contentious issues in potential peace negotiations. Ukraine maintains that full restoration of its territorial integrity is non-negotiable, while Russia insists on recognition of its claimed annexations. International sanctions linked to Crimea and Donbas are likely to remain in place as long as Russia occupies these territories, complicating any future economic recovery. For the civilian population, the human cost has been immense. Those remaining in active combat zones face daily threats from artillery, missiles, and airstrikes, along with critical shortages of water, electricity, and medical care. In Russian-occupied areas, residents face forced adoption of Russian citizenship, filtration, procedures to identify those with pro-Ukrainian sympathies, mobilization into Russian forces, and the imposition of Russian language and curriculum in education. The conflict has also had profound identity implications. Russia's actions have paradoxically strengthened Ukrainian national identity and unity, including in predominantly Russian-speaking eastern regions that previously had stronger pro-Russian sentiments. Support for NATO membership and European integration has reached historic highs across all regions of government-controlled Ukraine, while attitudes toward Russia have deteriorated dramatically. Archaeological, historical, and cultural heritage in both Crimea and Donbas faces systematic threats under occupation. In Crimea, Russia has conducted controversial archaeological excavations, particularly at sites like ancient Turkic Chasonesos, removing artifacts to Russian museums and advancing historical narratives that emphasize Russian rather than Ukrainian or Crimean Tatar connections to the peninsula. Similarly, in occupied Donbas, museums have been reorganized to emphasize Russian and Soviet historical narratives while minimizing Ukrainian cultural contributions. The ultimate resolution of these territorial disputes will likely define Ukraine's future geopolitical orientation, Russia's relationship with the international community, and the broader European security architecture. As the conflict continues, both regions remain at the center of Europe's most dangerous territorial dispute since World War II, with profound implications for international norms regarding borders, human rights, and the prohibition on the use of force in international relations.